So, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. Inshallah, today we are going to continue the tafsir for Surah al-Ma'idah. And yesterday we were really working on this ayah. يا أيها الرسول بلغ ما أنزل إليك من ربك وإن لم تفعل فما بلغت رسالته والله يعصمك من الناس إن الله لا يهدي القوم الكافرين. And we said that after, of course, the details that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was telling us in terms of course, the Bani Israel and the Yahud in particular, and Ahl al-Kitab, that there is a certain paradigm. And this paradigm is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had sent throughout history a revelation that was to give the prescription of what and how we understand life and how we would put in the solutions to bring about justice, to bring about solutions to the different problems that we might encounter. And we looked over here at some of the things, what it actually means to go against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Of course, whether we're speaking about the vision and understanding Allah and the implications it has on the individual level, on the community level, and certainly on a global level. And then we went into going to Surah Al-Rahman. Remember that piece of it? We went into going to Surah Al-Rahman, connecting the dots together and understanding through Surah Al-Rahman how we can understand that there is a certain paradigm, that there is an area that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given us on what makes So, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone, inshallah. What makes a stable, sorry about that, what makes a stable foundation within the society, and certainly how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically had given us, sorry about that, how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given us the understanding uh, to one, understanding the situation, and also understanding what would make a fair and a just, let's say, prescription to bring about justice within the society. And we connected that with Surah Al-Rahman, and we said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was telling us that there is a pattern in the world, whether in the space. الرحمن علم القرآن خلق الإنسان علمه البيان الشمس والقمر بحسبان. So here we go. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was telling us that there is a certain pattern, that in order to understand the whole pattern, to understand the situation, to understand how this world was created, whether in the creation of a human being or a shamsu wal qamaru bihusban, or at in astrophysics, and understand right there how the universe was founded, الشمس والقمر بحسبان والنجم والشجر يسجدان, or even understanding how, whether we're speaking about what is underneath your feet in terms of the foundation of earth, or whether it's up in the universe or it's within your creation. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us وَأَقِيمُوا الْوَزْنَ وَلَا تُخْسِرُوا الْمِيزَانَ, that the whole thing was actually founded in order to be tested. أَقِيمُوا الْوَزْنَ وَلَا تُخْسِرُوا الْمِيزَانَ. And this, of course, in order to understand the different things that happen around us. Many times people would be confused. Why is it that we would have some people, even though they're evil, but they're having the power to do the wrong thing? Why wouldn't Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala stop them? Someone might question that. It's important to remember that in order to have justice, you need to have two things. Number one, understand and know what justice is. And there's no way that you can know justice by deep ponderance, Whether you want to tell me John Locke, you want to tell me David Hume, you want to tell me all those different philosophers that were out there, whether we're speaking about Western philosophers or whether we're talking about Plato and we're talking about Greek philosophers or probably other philosophers in other countries, whether we're speaking about Confucius, and the list goes on and on. Of course, in the end, in order to understand the situation, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically lets us know that two things make justice. Number one, which is understanding the situation. Two, and giving the right prescription. These two things are basically needed, and there's no way that you can have that unless, and you can apply it unless you have the power to enforce such laws. Keep that in mind. Now, it can happen that someone can have the power to enforce injustice, and they can enforce, let's say, another type of power that they can put on ground, but that doesn't mean that they were capable of applying justice on ground. This doesn't necessarily mean that their power, and just by having the power to do something, it doesn't mean that you're doing the right thing. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given the individual and therefore collectively given all people basically the free will. Free will doesn't mean that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is accepting what you're doing. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala let us know that there are two kinds of mashi'ah. There's one that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or even when we're speaking about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, al-mashi'a, there is al-kawniyya and there's al-mashi'a, that is at-tashri'iyya. There are two things. Number one, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given us free will. That is part of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had put within nature. Why would he do that? Well, there's no way that you can be tested if you were going to be forced to do something. So that piece of it, let me write that down so we could just remember what we were talking about last time. We had mentioned it before. We're just here reviewing. We didn't even start yet, okay? This is considered just complete revision. All right. So we said that there's al-mashi'a al-kawniyya, and we said that there's al-mashi'a at-tashri'iyya. I don't know what's happening to, okay, here we go. What's the screen that you guys are seeing? You're seeing the Quran, right? Okay.
Yes, that's what we're seeing.
Okay, so remember when we said that there is al-mashi'a al-kawniyya and al-mashi'a al-tashri'iyya. What is al-mashi'a al-kawniyya? Al-mashi'a al-kawniyya is basically the natural will, and basically that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had put within the universe. And why is that? Why did he even do that? Well, that's because you're being tested. There's no way that you can be tested and you're forced to basically do a certain thing, and you're not given the free will to be tested. But at the same time, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there is al-mashi'a at-tashri'iyya, which is the legislating will. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the legislating will, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَا يَرْضَى لِعِبَادِهِ الْكُفْرَ. And the Lord Almighty does not accept for his servants, in other words, the people, to commit kufr. So there is a certain let's say revelation that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accepted certain things, and therefore to go out of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had considered as acceptable is basically letting the person go against what would create stability on ground. So let's keep those two areas in mind and understand that why certain people might actually do the wrong thing. They would assume that whenever somebody is doing something evil, that there's supposed to be a divine intervention to stop the person, or at least to take out and basically freeze their natural will in order to make sure that there is only one thing that is happening, which is the good thing. If we were expecting that divine intervention was going to be happening every single time that anything evil is going to happen, then in that situation, there would be no test, because we would just expect a divine intervention to happen, and therefore we would basically just recline and let God do the job. And then we would not in any way advance or even be considered as practicing al-Khilafah, because we would let the Lord Almighty do the job and we don't have to do anything. There would be no meaning to nobility. There would be no meaning to any type of let's say human intervention or human advancement, because we would just consider that God Almighty is going to intervene and He's going to make everybody live happily ever after, and then assuming that, well, that's it. If God Almighty is good, then He's going to let basically only the good thing happen, and therefore we don't have to worry about any noble action. We won't have to worry about any intervention. We won't have to worry about perhaps any studying, because whether somebody got ill, or perhaps whether it's the fear that we might find in nature, we would just expect that there's going to be a divine intervention, and certainly then in that situation we would think that with that imagination, we would think that we're supposed to be living in heaven. So this dunya is a dunya where we are tested. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us throughout all the revelation, throughout all history, that it was all about ولو أنهم أقاموا التوراة والإنجيل وما أنزل إليهم من ربهم لأكلوا من فوقهم ومن تحت أرجلهم منهم أمة مقتصدة وكثير منهم ساء ما يعملون. وكثير منهم ساء ما يعملون. Now, looking at that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us if they had applied the rules, what is aqamu? Aqamu means they would do two things. Number one, they would apply the rules of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and number two, they would basically enforce, look at this word, enforce that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's rules are enforced on ground, they're applied on earth, that it's not just a theory, but in order to make sure that others are also implementing it. In other words, it's not only an individual choice, an individual practice, but it's also a government and, let's say, an authority that's ensuring that justice is applied on ground, applied on earth. And this is what the word aqamu means. Well, this isn't necessarily just Islam saying that we need to have the force, but this is the same thing with each and every single governance. They'll also always say that we need to ensure, and they'll have their definition of justice, and then they'll basically use the different forces, whether it's using the United Nations, or whether it's using different military powers, or whether it's perhaps even committing injustices under the name of bringing in justice, under the name of ensuring that the world is living in peace, and the list goes on and on, when in reality they could actually be the main ones to bring about instability and certainly oppression within the society. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us of Fir'aun and others, because be careful from the narrative. The narrative itself can carry a lot of manipulation. That's why even Iblis, when he was coming to Prophet Adam alayhi salam, He told him and gave him a narrative. أَوَلَا أَدُلُّكَ عَلَى شَجَرَةِ الْخُلْدِ وَمُلْكٍ لَا يَبْلَى. Gave him a narrative that seemed like a narrative of peace, that seemed like a narrative of prosperity. مُلْكٍ لَا يَبْلَى. What more do you want? It's nothing but prosperity. شَجَرَةِ الْخُلْد. It's nothing but eternity. It's going to bring you happiness. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was basically letting us be aware of the different narratives that carry a lot of manipulation and the different rhetorics that can be very manipulating without us realizing, taking not only the individuals, but taking the masses into an area of nothing but mere injustice, but battles and wars and animosity, and the list goes on, and certainly a lot of fasad and corruption on earth. So this is just a prelude, okay? This is just a prelude. So then the ayat would continue and tell us, well, is it possible that this can create prosperity, whether we're speaking about لَأَكَلُوا مِنْ فَوْقِهِمْ وَمِنْ تَحْتِ أَرْجُلِهِمْ, that they would eat from basically food coming from of course, min fawqihim, whether it's over them, whether we're speaking about rain, whether we're speaking about the vegetation, or whether we're speaking about, of course, the combination of these two. In the end, we're speaking about not only food, but we're speaking about fair distribution in wealth. Now, this is when we're speaking about أكلوا من فوقهم ومن تحت أرجلهم. Certainly, this is to make it simple to understand, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was talking about fair distribution in general. That is simply what all people would seek. So when we're speaking about أقاموا التوراة والإنجيل, that they had basically were prescribed, they were ordered to apply the words of the Torah and the Injil and وَمَا أُنزِلَ إِلَيْهِمْ, and what was revealed onto them, which is the Quran. So in other words, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us throughout the revelation, throughout history, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's message was one message. That is the message that you would turn to the Lord Almighty, and that is the message that in order to apply justice, there's no way to understand justice, to understand and analyze the situation unless you use the lens of Quran to help you understand the situation and therefore bring about the solutions to bring about and ensure justice. And justice certainly usually is related to fair distribution, related to, of course, what we as human beings are seeking, which is maximizing happiness and certainly minimizing pain. That's what we seek as human beings. It's part of our nature that we're trying to minimize pain, maximize happiness. We're trying to get a level of stability, and we're not speaking about maximizing happiness for one nation or minimizing or at the expense of other people's pains, because that would be certainly a form of injustice. So what is happening today, we're seeing, of course, certain countries going into advancement at the expense of what? At the expense of the African countries basically going into suffering. That's basically what's happening. At the expense of that suffering, we're basically then, of course, portraying them that they're the ones that are basically at the end of the scale of evolution. They just cannot think. They just cannot somehow go up stronger and get stronger and become smarter to use their resources. So therefore, we would basically give ourselves the justification that, yes, we are smarter, we are stronger, therefore, at the expense of others, giving ourselves the justification to somehow steal these resources, even if it brings pain, and even if we would inject them with diseases, that it's just simply, well, it is necessary in order to basically live, that the ends justify the means, and therefore it would be considered as, hey, this is basically going to be a form of victory, a form of success, and portraying a certain country as an advanced civilized country, even though its civilization was actually built at the expense of course, enslaving others, abusing other people's resources. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is basically letting us know that that justice does not come in let's call it in a way that is bent, in a way that is bringing in harm to others, and at the same time thinking that you're maximizing the good to your own self and at the expense of the others' pains. This is basically a form of injustice, which is why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was telling us about that ولا يزيدن كثيرا منهم ما أنزل إليك من ربك طغيانا وكفرا. Many will simply want to turn away from the revelation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and what that would increase them in is nothing but transgression, oppression, and certainly leaving Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and therefore nothing but animosity, nothing but hate until, of course, Judgment Day, because they will just feed on other people's pains. So they will just want to engage in more and more war. So that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala takes the Prophet ﷺ and tells him, Ya ayyuha Rasul, O Prophet of Allah, بلغ ما أنزل إليك من ربك. You've got one duty to do, which is تبليغ الرسالة, which is announcing and letting other people learn of the revelations that the Lord Almighty had sent upon you. وَإِن لَمْ تَفْعَلْ. And if you had not done so, then you had not revealed what was revealed unto you. وَاللَّهُ يَعْصِمُكَ مِنَ النَّاسِ. And the Lord Almighty would be the one to protect you, would be the one to give you the security, because you are a prophet for the Lord Almighty. You're going to be protected, and you're going to basically give in that mission that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had asked you to give. Inna Allah la yahdi al-qawma al-kafirin. Since you recognize you are the prophet, you recognize that you've got a mission, and we also went in certain, of course, timeline of what throughout history, of course, what the revelation, and certainly the story of the revelation, and we basically shared a screen that gives us the different timelines of what da'wah during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, how the Prophet ﷺ went from one stage of the starting of al-Wahy, then went into prophethood, then went into, of course, taking the risala, taking the message, and went into, of course, a state or a time in a transition into just compromising not the deen, but compromising their own pains, even when others would attack them. Never compromise the deen, but you can compromise on your own pains. Then the ayah went into, or the ayat were coming in, a new transition, which is ordering them for jihad, or ordering them to right now build their forces, right now prepare for a new mission, for a new transition, where you're going to then come out of being a person to compromise even on your pains, to later even defend yourselves. And that's when the following transition was coming, al-mithl, in where you were going to be defending yourself in the equal amount of pain that is coming at you. You're going to be given the right to defend yourself in an equal amount and inflicting them the same amount of pain, since they are wanting to basically stop you from engaging in da'wah. Then therefore you're going to prepare yourself for another transition, which is to actually go and fight evil and ensure that you're going to go with full potential to ensure that the words and certainly that the revelation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is bringing about the end to war, the end of hatred and animosity, and the end to oppression. And that cannot be done unless it's an end to kufr. Got it? Unless it's an end to kufr. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this basically was in the early stages. بَلِّغْ مَا أُنزِلَ إِلَيْكَ. But of course, بَلِّغْ مَا أُنزِلَ إِلَيْكَ was not only in the early stages, but this was revealed in the early stages. But بَلِّغْ مَا أُنزِلَ إِلَيْكَ مِنْ رَبِّكَ وَإِن لَمْ تَفْعَلْ فَمَا بَلَّغْتَ رِسَالَتَهُ. We remember we said that Surah al-Maida was generally a Madani surah. In other words, it was revealed during the time that the Prophet ﷺ was in Medina, and certainly after Hijrah and not before Hijrah. So let's continue. Yesterday we were talking about Ya ayyuha Rasul balligh ma unzila ilayka min rabbik, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was telling him that he had the duty to basically announce what revelation was revealed onto him. And certainly that was in the early stages when the Prophet ﷺ was in fear. And we went in also and talked about, well, what about Umar ibn Khattab? Is he more courageous? We answered that one, and we said that the Prophet ﷺ was ordered to basically take in consideration وَمَنِ اتَّبَعَكَ مِنَ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ, take in consideration the weaker people that were following the Prophet ﷺ, because to put their life at risk was going to bring about the whole risk to eliminating Islam in its early stages. And this is important to understand, that al-hikmah and wisdom is crucial to understanding how we would apply the rules. And I would, yesterday I got a question. I'm going to jump to a different topic for a bit. I got a question yesterday. The question was saying that there were a number of different scholars in the West that were saying that it's permissible for young women, 18, 19, etc., to move out of their parents' house and basically live alone, and that there's nothing in the text that says that it's haram. How do we respond to it? Is that true? Here's one thing. Some starters in fiqh would think that it's all coming from the text. That's a very beginner in fiqh. Fiqh is not only dependent on text. There's also another thing, which is maqasid al-sharia. Maqasid al-sharia, or the legal maxims in Islam, were also part and a main resource in understanding Islam. There's another part, which is al-hukmu ala al-shay'i far'un an tasawwurihi. When you want to make a ruling, there's one very important thing that you really need to understand, which is how you would see in the long term the implication of such a fatwa. What are we looking at? What is it leading to? And that's why when we look at part of the different, of course, qawa'id fiqhiyya, the different legal maxims in Islam, you would see that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was giving us a number of different resources to understand that sadd al-dhara'i'. What is sadd al-dhara'i'? Removing whatever leads to wronghood, even if it's on the long run. Even if it sounds that, hey, that's what Islam would order. Just like the ayah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَا تَسُبُّوا آلِهَتَهُمْ فَيَسُبُّ اللَّهَ عَدْوًا بِغَيْرِ عِلْمٍ. Don't swear and don't say derogatory things at their gods. Why? To avoid their retaliation, a reaction that they might come with, which probably is saying bad things about Allah Himself. The ayah was really straightforward. What was it looking at? But we already know that their gods are basically fake gods. Yes, we know their gods are fake gods, but if you're going to be saying it in that way and at them, you're going to provoke them to somehow probably come at Islam, and that's not what you're supposed to be bringing. And this is important. Sadd al-dhara'a is key to understanding also the aim that Islam had come with. It's not enough to look at the text, but ruh and the inspiration and on the long, in the long run, and on the other end, what Islam really is trying to bring in. Number one, the preservation of deen. 2, the preservation of life and health. 3, the preservation of mental health. 4, the preservation of chastity. 5, the preservation of property. What we're seeing right now is that many of our Muslim, whether male or female, but certainly it would be a lot more dangerous on the girls than the boys to move out of their home, their families' homes. It's not enough to just look at the text. And we're seeing, of course, some dua, and unfortunately, we would see many thinking that, no, this is basically an open-minded da'iyah, an open-minded mufti, a person that grew within the West, not realizing that, no, when you're looking at the text, this is, and not seeing the implication, that's a very narrowed down perspective, because the text itself was also telling us that we're supposed to be reading the implications with hikmah. We're supposed to be going farther, because hawa can even, what is hawa? Our own desires can sometimes even manipulate the way we read text. Why? How is it that hawa can manipulate us in reading the text? Yes, hawa can sometimes come in, and without us realizing, we would think we're reading the text, but the text cannot be separated and exacerbated from reading the reality, and in the long run, where this is taking us. 2/3 of Islam, of fiqh, is based on sadd al-dhara'a, is based on closing the means that lead to evil. There's no way that you can have fiqh unless you do 2 things: study the text and study the reality on ground. That's fiqh. To think that fiqh is just, well, taking the words within, let's say, bidayat al-mujtahid, or going to the books of fiqh, and nope, I've got the rule right there, and this is what I'm going to apply, and yes, I've got a text right there from Bada' al-Sana', and I'm going to take it, and therefore, and I'm going to basically shove it in their faces, and going to say right there, tell it to them. Okay, wait a minute, calm down. Al-fiqh is to understand and have hikmah. Let me take you to an ayah. We're going to get there. So this page that we're on is what? Let's look at this page that we're on. This page that we're on, oh, I can't see it. Okay, here we go. Okay. Right there, I'm going to take you. Let's go to Surah Sad for a bit. It's relating to what we're talking about. We're going to go to Surah Sad. And in Surah Sad, there's something that really goes right into what we're talking about. Let's look at Surah Sad. In Surah Sad, it tells us the story of Prophet Prophet Dawood عليه السلام. What happened? Here we go. Let's look at it. اصبر على ما يقولون واذكر عبدنا داود ذا الأيدي إنه أواب. What does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tell Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam? He tells him, be patient on what they're saying. In other words, this is not new that they're going to be accusing you of different things. But then he tells him a story. واذكر عبدنا داود. Just remember the story of our servant Dawood. ذا الأيدي. ذا الأيدي, it doesn't mean he had multiple hands, looking like those Hindu gods. No. ذا الأيدي actually means it's a metaphor that he had numerous types of powers. He had a power to control the jinn, a power to control, guess what? Even when it came to the ability to control different elements like hadid, like iron. He was dealing with iron like he was dealing with some kind of clay. Didn't even need to bang it. No, in his hands, he would basically mold iron like he's molding clay. And certainly, he had, of course, his governance, his monarchy, his kingdom went so far and stretched so far and had all different kinds of powers, controlled the jinn, controlled the animals, controlled even the birds. إِنَّا سَخَّرْنَا الْجِبَالَ مَعَهُ. Even the mountains would basically be under his power. يُسَبِّحْنَ بِالْعَشِيِّ وَالْإِشْرَاقِ. He would be basically doing tasbih. The jibal, the mountains, would be doing tasbih بالعشي throughout the night and even during the day. In early morning, they would be echoing in dhikr with Prophet Dawood عليه السلام. يا سلام يا سلام. والطير محشورة كل له أواب. Even the birds. Hey, you can control the things on earth, but if you're controlling the birds, well, the birds, they've got the space to control right there. But the space, they're mahshura. They're basically under his power. They don't have any ability to run and flee away and fly away. And no, they're mahshura. They're under his power. كل له أواب. Everything was basically under his command. He would give the command and he would basically be the master king. وشددنا ملكه وآتيناه الحكمة وفصل الخطاب. شددنا ملكه, his power, his kingdom was basically strongly enforced. شددنا, strongly enforced from every single end. But here's one thing. How did that happen? He said, وَآتَيْنَاهُ الْحِكْمَةَ وَفَصْلَ الْخِطَابِ. Two things were key things to basically give him this kind of power, this kind of governance. آتَيْنَاهُ الْحِكْمَةِ. He was given hikmah, wisdom. What is wisdom? That's what we're talking about in understanding text. Al-hikmah. Al-hikmah is going farther than understanding your situation, but you're going farther in understanding the implication to lead to a good consequence. This is al-hikmah. To lead to a good consequence. To lead to the consequence where it's preserving the deen, preserving the life and health, preserving the mental health, preserving chastity, and preserving property. That's al-hikmah. But to understand the text in a myopic vision is not hikmah. It's lacking fiqh. Al-fiqh is to understand the text and understand the ruh, the soul, the spirit of what the text is trying to take you to. وَفَصْلَ الْخِطَابِ. Another thing is important is the ability to have eloquent speech to reach the masses. وَفَصْلَ الْخِطَابِ. To be able to understand the text, to be able to understand the words, and be able to scrutinize and analyze what is being said and be able to give eloquent speech to bring about an understanding to the person in front of you, and you understand it. Now, this is extremely important because, especially in perhaps the West, we unfortunately right now, and even let's say in our modern society, we're basically not taking things like literature and not taking words, and of course learning how to write and learning how to speak. We're not taking it seriously, and we would think that what's important is basically just perhaps becoming doctors or becoming engineers, and this is definitely missing out that what really makes leadership is learning hikmah and fasl al-khitab, learning how to understand the words and how to project and make words understood by others in a way that's going to reach the heart and make a fair argument. وهل أتاك نبأ الخصم إذ تسوروا المحراب? Do you, and then it takes us to another story. So this is chapter 1, giving us a prelude to the story. And then he says, well, do you know the story when these two, al-khasm, these two that were in a dispute, what did they do? Well, tasawwaru al-mihrab. When they had basically entered, what did they do? The fortress where Prophet Dawood was in, it basically had huge and certainly high walls in order to keep Prophet Dawood alayhi salam protected, of course. He's the king. But what happened? Prophet Dawood alayhi salam, even though a king, was controlling everything, but he was spending a long amount and a very, of course, a good amount of time in al-mihrab. What is al-mihrab? Al-mihrab is basically the corner that he was worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in. That's al-mihrab. You know, when you go enter the masjid, there's this round thing, you know, kind of like an arch thing that would be in the middle. That's al-mihrab. Okay, it doesn't have to be in an arch, but al-mihrab would basically be what is designated for salah. Could be a corner in your home, could be a corner in the masjid, a corner in his fortress. That was the corner for his ibadah. إذ دخلوا على داود. What did they do? Well, they went in and ففزع منهم. He got scared. He didn't expect them. Why? Because he basically thought that they were coming in to assassinate him. فزع منهم. So the response, they said, لا تخاف. Don't be afraid. We're not here to attack you. خصمان بغى بعضنا على بعض. فاحكم بيننا بالحق ولا تشطط. We're just two that basically went into a dispute. بغى بعضنا على بعض. We basically had attacked one another, or somehow one of us abused the other. So what we want of you, فاحكم بيننا بالحق. We want you to rule amongst us with truth. ولا تشطط. And don't exceed the limit. واهدنا إلى سواء الصراط. And we want you to guide us to the straight path. Let's say a number of different things here. فاحكم بيننا بالحق. That's number 1. You've got a rule. You've got truth. ولا تشطط. And don't exceed the limit. In other words, this is important. واهدنا إلى سواء الصراط. And guide us to the right path. This is fiqh. Keep this in mind, everybody. Some scholars actually said that these weren't real people. So what do you mean they weren't real people, Jin? No. Some scholars actually said that these were actually malaika. They were coming to demonstrate to Prophet Dawood alayhi salam and demonstrate how he's supposed to be ruling. I want you to look at this one. فاحكم بيننا بالحق. You've got the resource. ولا تشطط. And ولا تشطط, don't exceed the limit. You've got a text. You've got a certain way to read the text. You've got the legal maxims. And what is that supposed to get to? إلى سواء الصراط. That's supposed to get you, yes, إلى سواء الصراط, where it's supposed to get you to a consequence, where it's supposed to bring in justice. Justice in our modern times is only, of course, understood that it's a transgression that one might do on somebody's life or health or property. In Islam, no, this is a very narrow definition of justice. In Islam, the definition of justice exceeds that. The definition of justice is basically, in Islam, you're bringing in justice in your vision about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in your understanding about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, two, in people's health, the society the preservation of people's health and people's lives, and three, people's mental health, and four, people's, of course, chastity and family, and number five, property. Just keep that in mind. Now, this is probably the third time that we mentioned the legal maxims right there, but this is really important. So when we're speaking about fiqh, فَحْكُمْ بَيْنَنَا بِالْحَقِّ, there's a certain area, بالحق, there's a certain text, there's a certain revelation that's going to define truth for you. وَلَا تُشْطِط. Why وَلَا تُشْطِط? Because it can happen that we can have a text, but to interpret the text, we're human beings. We can have multiple influences and multiple things that might have impacted the way we read the text, whether it's because of male, female, perhaps some trauma we went through in our early childhood, or perhaps the situation that we're in, or maybe the emotional state that we're in at that moment. That all of that can affect how we might judge things, on how we basically might look at a case here or there. So that's where, of course, it's important, in order to make sure that you're understanding the text right, you're looking through another lens, which is وَهْدِنَا إِلَى سَوَاءِ الصِّرَاطِ. You're making sure you're reading the text and you're looking at the long run, that it's supposed to be leading to a fair and certainly to a good consequence. What is the story? Well, the story, my brother, had 99 different, sheep, and they I only have one sheep. And then, of course, the story, of course, عزني في الخطاب, basically somehow, I guess, he was capable of defending and putting forward his argument. That's the story is mentioned elsewhere, but I'm trying, in order to not get off the whole theme that I'm trying to get to here. But Prophet Dawood عليه السلام قال لقد ظلمك بسؤال نعجتك إلى نعاجه وإن كثيرا من الخلطاء لا يبغي بعضهم على بعض إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وقليل ما هم. Now that sounded pretty straightforward. He didn't even give the other person the chance to speak. But then right away, why was he in a rush to basically get this story over with? He was in a rush because he was enjoying a moment of dhikr in his mihrab. So to him, he considered that they had disrupted his moment of religious and spiritual seclusion. So he wanted to get this case over with as soon as possible, in order to get to his moment of spiritual seclusion as soon as possible. So he basically made, let's say, the trial short, and didn't give it the time that it deserves, that is necessary to hear both sides. So you right away, he abused you. He wasn't supposed to do what he had done. And basically made a statement. كثيرا من الخلطاء, many of those that they would abuse one another, except the ones that are in faith and عملوا الصالحات وقليل ما هم. Then Dawood عليه السلام recognize that it was فتناه, that it was, what was it? It was a demonstration. That's why some scholars actually said that these weren't real people. That was most likely, though they were most likely angels trying to demonstrate and teach him how governance is supposed to be done. فاستغفر ربه. That's when he basically did istighfar and recognized that it was basically testing him. It was teaching him how and what it means to do fair judgment. How it is not only to be looking at one side, but you also need to look at the fair end. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, Ya Dawood, inna ja'alnaka khalifatan fil ard. Dawood, you were made as a khalifa, as a khalifa, as one to rule by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as a king, as one, as a prophet, to demonstrate, to make sure that you would instill justice. Therefore, semicolon, فَاحْكُمْ بَيْنَ النَّاسِ بِالْحَقِّ. So rule amongst people with truth. How do I know what truth is? Well, you're going to have to go back to what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had taught you in text, but that's not enough. You can fall in your own, let's say, interpretations that can carry you somewhere else. وَلَا تَتَّبِعِ الْهَوَى. Make sure that you do not follow your whims. How do I know that I'm not following the whims? Because you want to keep in mind, فَيُضِلَّكَ عَنْ سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ. إن الذين يضلون عن سبيل الله لهم عذاب شديد بما نسوا يوم الحساب. How do I know that I'm basically not going off the track and not going off في سبيل الله? And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically lets us know وما خلقنا السماء والأرض وما بينهما باطلا. There's a certain paradigm. The heavens and the earth, you would say that there's a certain time. What happens in time? This is key. It's not enough to look at the situation now. 10 years from now, if you are going back to that fatwa, 10 years from now, 5 years from now, you're giving the girl the fatwa to move out of her home, out of her family's home. What's going to happen? What's going to happen is that she's going to be susceptible not only to her hawa, but to other people's hawa. She's not going to have the mentorship that is necessary, that is coming from hikmah, from family, giving her the mentorship that is necessary to help her make the right choices. Not only then, but the choices that will be found perhaps 5 or 10 years from now, they're definitely going to be a life changer. They're going to change everything. So what do we need? We need fatawa that understand not only that moment, but understand how we are getting many girls moving out of their homes and then becoming an easy target to those wild human beings, or wild in the shape of a human being, basically finding these girls alone and coming at them without them realizing. And then, of course, they would come to them and it would be consensual, believe it or not, it would be consensual, because, of course, it is part of our creation, it is part of girls' nature that we're basically wanting to get some form of social acceptance. We compromise easily. This is a reality. We compromise easily. We don't want to hurt other people, so we compromise easily, and then we get basically ourselves into an area where we're becoming victims, and then because we compromised and we didn't realize that we basically had become victims and put ourselves into hellfire without us realizing. What did we do? We compromised our deen. We compromised our deen at the expense of what? the expense of what? We compromised our deen in order to make sure that other people are basically accepting us. And this is important to understand in fatwa. Have al-hikmah. Understand the text, the legal maxims, and also those many cases, how most of those cases actually led many to going into fitan, whether they were being abused or they themselves compromised their faith in consenting to compromise their faith. And this is extremely important to just keep in mind. Keep in mind these areas, how we would understand fiqh and how we would understand that in order to understand بلغ ما أنزل إليك من ربك وإن لم تفعل, there are certain things you cannot compromise. وإن لم تفعل فما بلغت رسالته. You just have to deliver the message and not worry about whether they accept it or not. That's their responsibility. Your responsibility is to basically understand the text, deliver the text. بلغ ما أنزل إليك من ربك. Now that's taking us into, well, how do we understand that this ayah, of course, revealed, and the Prophet ﷺ, was he necessarily, of course, hiding something as claimed by the Shia? What was really happening? Why did it say وَإِن لَمْ تَفْعَلْ فَمَا بَلَّغْتَ رِسَالَتَهُ? Well, there was a story that was, I guess, according to some scholars, that was the reason for it. What is the story? Zainab bint Jahsh. Zainab bint Jahsh. She was the Prophet ﷺ's cousin. What happened? Well, at the time, it was part of the culture that if someone adopted a boy or a girl, that they would be treated like their own biological children. And from that sense, and from that, I guess, culture, it was seen that it was basically the norm, and therefore you couldn't go against it. If you were to go against it, well, that actually would mean you had committed the least an illicit behavior, or somehow, basically based on their definition, it would be a form of incest. But here's one thing. In the beginning, Zainab bint Jahsh was ordered to marry Zayd ibn Haritha. Zainab bint Jahsh refused in the beginning, but the ayah said, وَمَا كَانَ لِمُؤْمِنٍ وَلَا مُؤْمِنَةٍ إِذَا قَضَى اللَّهُ وَرَسُولُهُ أَمْرًا أَن يَكُونَ لَهُمُ الْخِيرَةُ مِنْ أَمْرِهِمْ. If it's not befit for a believing man or a believing woman, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decrees a matter, that they would put their own choices before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Zaynab bint Jahsh gets married, but she still couldn't handle her life with Zayd ibn Haritha. Zayd ibn Haritha was the Prophet ﷺ's adopted son, to the point that he was actually named Zayd ibn Muhammad ﷺ. Zayd ibn Haritha, what is his story? How did he become a slave? Well, Zayd ibn Haritha, his mother was from Medina, and his mother was visiting her family. Some tribe come in and invade Medina, and they basically kidnap Zayd ibn Haritha. Well, he gets sold as a slave. He was kidnapped, so to them, I guess these invaders, to them, well, here's something that we can make a fortune out of. Sure thing. They sold him. Well, who buys him? Hakim ibn Khuzam. Who's that? Well, that's basically a relative for Sayyidah Khadija. He buys him and he basically gives him as a gift to Sayyidah Khadija. It's like, I bought you a slave. Here you go. And Zayd ibn Haritha lives with, of course, and within the home of the Prophet ﷺ. But the Prophet ﷺ freed him and adopted him as a son. That's the whole story of Zayd ibn Haritha. Then his family basically learns and knows about Zayd ibn Haritha, basically that he was found. He's found, his family come over and basically ask the Prophet ﷺ, can we have our son back? So the Prophet ﷺ basically lets Zayd ibn Haritha make the choice. Do you want to go back to them or would you want to stay with me? He was approximately 13 years old at the time. He chose to stay with the Prophet ﷺ and not go back to his family. So Zayd ibn Haritha continued, and the ayah in Surah Al-Ahzab basically ordered the Prophet ﷺ, "Ud'uhum li'abaihim." When you want to name those adopted children, you have to name them based on their parents' names, their father's name. That's how you want to do it. That's justice. It was a transition. The Prophet ﷺ, now we understand how you feel towards him, to the point that you had adopted him as your own son. But that doesn't change the truth of the matter that he's not your biological son. What should you do? We want you to rename him as Zayd ibn Haritha and not Zayd ibn Muhammad. You have to live in truth and accept the truth. So the Prophet ﷺ succumbs to the order of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But then Zainab bint Jahsh, of course, Zayd ibn Haritha now is early 20s, or I guess within that age. Zainab bint Jahsh was the Prophet ﷺ's cousin. So she's a noble woman coming from a noble tribe. And when she got married to Zayd ibn Haritha, she still couldn't, I guess, somehow accept that she's married to Zayd ibn Haritha. I'm a noble woman. Why am I married to an ex-slave? She couldn't take it. So she would continue to somehow, I guess, Zayd ibn Haritha then couldn't handle this life with her. But the Prophet ﷺ was somehow seeing and was basically within all of this. The Prophet ﷺ was trying to bring about reconciliation between Zayd ibn Haritha and Zainab bint Jahsh. Zayd ibn Haritha could not handle it. So the Prophet ﷺ was knowing that there is going to be an order coming down the road, that in order to end this culture of how an adopted son is treated, that the Prophet ﷺ was going to be ordered to marry Zainab bint Jahsh. It was something that was not, that he wasn't familiar with. Neither was the society. But the ayah was straightforward, telling him that we're letting her marry you. You're going to marry her now. But the Prophet ﷺ had some form of, how am I going to do this? Why is this? It was, but no. You need to break a custom that was based on some form of a manipulation that they had made. and you're going to practice it right there before them. زوجناكها. Why? So there would be no haraj on the later community, on the later Muslims, في أزواج أدعيائهم, in getting married to the wives of their adopted sons or daughters, of course. Well, so the Prophet ﷺ, of course, then this ayah, وَإِن لَمْ تَفْعَلْ فَمَا بَلَّغْتَ رِسَالَتَهُ. You have to reveal what was revealed unto you. And if you don't reveal it, then you didn't complete the revelation. Now, here's one thing, is that some scholars, they said, well, it's basically related when you're looking وَإِن لَمْ تَفْعَلْ فَمَا بَلَّغْتَ رِسَالَتَهُ. Some scholars said it was related to this story of Zainab bint Jahsh. And other scholars said وَالصَّحِيحُ الْقَوْلُ بِالْعُمُومِ. And this, of course, al-Qurtubi and majority of the scholars, they said وَالصَّحِيح, and the truth of the matter is that وَإِن لَمْ تَفْعَلْ فَمَا بَلَّغْتَ رِسَالَتَهُ, that it's a comprehensive statement and is not necessarily particular to any story or any event or any context, which is generally true. Why? Because العبرة بعموم اللفظ لا بخصوص السبب. What does that mean? Let's write it down. In general, the theme in all the revelations, of course, العبرة, the theme بعموم اللفظ لا بخصوص السبب. This is a general thing. Even if there was a particular context, there was a particular reason behind every revelation, it doesn't have to be exclusive to that circumstance, but it would be including and exclusive to all the different circumstances. And therefore, وَإِن لَمْ تَفْعَلْ فَمَا بَلَّغْتَ رِسَالَتَهُ, if you are not to reveal and certainly announce the revelation, then you did not commit to the mission that you were asked to do. So that's where, of course, we could see بلغ جميع ما أنزل إليك من ربك. Quote, Ibn Abbas said, well, what that means is that it was incumbent upon the Prophet ﷺ to deliver the message that was delivered and that was revealed unto him from the Lord Almighty. If you were to conceal anything of that revelation, then your mission was incomplete. And he said, and this is, and well, this is right there. This is the end of quote, I guess, for Ibn Abbas. But al-Qurtubi said, and this is basically تأديب للنبي. What does that mean? So تأديب is a form of discipline. You could see, just like Prophet Dawood alayhi salam. Remember when we talked about just today in Surah Sad, how واذكر عبدنا داود ذا الأيدي, right? Remember that one? The ayat, and we just did it. Well, that's where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was basically right there telling him, Ya Dawood, what was it? Well, you have one mission to do. What is it? احكم بين الناس بالحق. That's it. You've got one thing to do. And that's the same thing. That this is a ta'deeb. This is to basically train the Prophet ﷺ, teach the Prophet ﷺ that what you are supposed to be doing is basically delivering the message, not changing it, not altering it in any way to gain acceptance, and certainly never compromise the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala at the expense of basically getting some form of social acceptance, some form of even political power. The words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are never to be compromised. And this is basically the same message that we are given, even if someone is basically a student of ilm, that they have a responsibility to not hide anything in Sharia, anything in Islam. Say it as it is, whether people like it or whether people don't like it. Whether people are finding it hard to apply, that's not your duty. Your duty is not to make things easy for them. Your duty is to deliver the message. Your duty is not to make it something that they will find somehow easy to absorb. And yes, that's really at least making me feel that you're open-minded, etc. Nope. What you're going to do is deliver the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, regardless of how people perceive it. That's it. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, basically, let's look at this hadith. I'm gonna, delete what we had written before. Okay, here we go. And in Sahih Muslim, let's look at this. Sayyidah Aisha, oh man, I wish I could tell you the story of Masruq later, inshallah. She said, من حدثك أن محمدا صلى الله عليه وسلم كتم شيئا من الوحي فقد كذب. والله تعالى يقول يا أيها الرسول بلغ ما أنزل إليك من ربك وإن لم تفعل فما بلغت رسالته. And of course, certainly, Sayyidah Aisha said, whoever told you that Muhammad ﷺ had concealed anything from the revelation, then they had committed a blatant lie. For the Lord Almighty says, O Prophet of Allah, deliver what was revealed onto you from your Lord, and if you had not done so, then you had not completed the mission of delivering the revelation. Now, this is extremely important to keep in mind because you could see many times, especially during our times, you could see people basically wanting to twist and bend the revelation or bend the Islamic rulings in order to somehow appear open-minded or somehow appear that they're pro-women or somehow appear that they're pro this or that group. At the end, you do not compromise the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to gain acceptance. It's supposed to be what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had delivered, and your job is to deliver the message. Wallahu ya'asimuka minan nas. Now, one thing I would like to say, you see these ayat right there, was it all revealed at the same time? So you could see, not necessarily. So, Wallahu ya'asimuka minan nas could be a portion that was revealed at another time. So this could be, Ya ayyuha rasulu balligh ma unzila ilayka min rabbik, and this would be revealed at one time, at one situation. And وَإِن لَمْ تَفْعَلْ فَمَا بَلَّغْتَ رِسَالَتَهُ, and another time, this portion of it. And وَاللَّهُ يَعْصِمُكَ مِنَ النَّاسِ, at another time, at another portion. What then you could see, right now you would read it, يَا أَيُّهَا الرَّسُولُ بَلَّغْ مَا أُنزِلَ إِلَيْكَ مِنْ رَبِّكَ وَإِن لَمْ تَفْعَلْ فَمَا بَلَّغْتَ رِسَالَتَهُ وَاللَّهُ يَعْصِمُكَ مِنَ النَّاسِ إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يَهْدِي الْقَوْمَ الْكَافِرِينَ. You could see that it's coherent. How is it that in a time span of 23 years where the Quran was revealed, the word is munajjama. What is munajjama? Munajjama actually means at different time intervals, different times and different situations, but each and every single one, the Prophet ﷺ would say, put this ayah after this ayah in that particular surah, and then you could see it in the coherence that you see it today. And even during that time, while the Quran was being revealed, it was sounding coherent as well. And now that's why the most important miracle for the Prophet ﷺ is the Quran. It's in the balagha itself. It's in the eloquence itself. Eloquence, whether we're speaking about coherence, whether we're speaking about the ideas, whether we're speaking about all of these areas. But how can I understand that such eloquence is so magnificent when, well, it can't be fair because I can't understand Arabic. So for me to somehow see the eloquence is not something that I'm able to see. We would say, well, when you would, if you were to study Arabic, there's absolutely no way that your eloquence is going to go and reach the level of the eloquence that the Arab at the time basically had during the time of the Prophet ﷺ. That was considered the highest level of eloquence in Lugha Arabiya ever, to the point that when you would see المعلقات, what are المعلقات? المعلقات are considered the best poetry ever written, and they were hung in the Kaaba. They were so mesmerized with eloquence and poetry and words and how eloquence is delivered that even the best of those, they basically wanted to challenge the Prophet ﷺ, and they recognized, just like when al-Walid ibn al-Mughira basically comes and wants the Prophet ﷺ to somehow compromise and stop delivering the speech of the Quran. So he would come to him, and then the Prophet ﷺ would read portions of the ayat, and then when everyone is waiting for al-Walid ibn al-Mughira to somehow manage to stop the Prophet ﷺ from delivering those ayat, they were hoping that he was going to manage to somehow convince the Prophet ﷺ to compromise and just take in and accept an offering to stop saying these words because they're too eloquent and they're controlling the minds and the hearts and of course controlling the masses within Mecca, and they know that it's going to reach farther, and to them that was going to mean at the expense of what was considered as the base of their economy. What was making their economy in Mecca? Well, they're a land that is not fertile. They were dependent on religious tourism. If the religious tourism, and by ending idolatry, was going to end from Mecca, to them, they perceived it that that was going to end religious tourism to come to Mecca, and therefore that was going to end their existence. That actually meant a life or death to them. So Walid ibn al-Mughira, when he comes out, he basically says, they're not the words of jinn. Did he become Muslim? He didn't become Muslim. But he said they're not the words of jinn and not the words of humans. They're beautiful words that I cannot describe. ما هو بقول الإنس ولا بقول الجن. There's nothing that I can do about that. That's it. وإنه لا يعلو ولا يعلى عليه. It is the highest thing ever. There's no way that we could go beyond such eloquence in any way whatsoever. So when you read this, يا أيها الرسول بلغ ما أنزل إليك من ربك وإن لم تفعل فما بلغت رسالته. Those are coming and revealed at different times, but then we read it in such eloquence, in such coherence. أشهد بأن محمد النبي. That's it. Right there. Let's continue right there. والله يعصمك من الناس.
Allahu Akbar.
Then, and you could see this right there. والله يعصمكم من الناس. Anybody that is any human being that would somehow, come forward with any idea that what they're seeking is some form of acceptance, some form of at least, hey, what am I going to do? they're probably going to let go. If they're going to offer me some form of power, maybe I'll use that power to later pass out my ideas, enforce my ideas somehow, and somehow, get, they'll basically compromise. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Wallahu ya'asimuka minan nas. Don't worry about how this message and how far this message is going to go. This is a man that from the early stages of da'wah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was letting him know that the success, the victory for this message is basically for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is left for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's why when he was fleeing Mecca, going to Medina, when Abu Bakr as-Siddiq was shivering, when the people of Quraysh were right there about to see him, he was basically at his complete serenity, completely calm. Abu Bakr as-Siddiq was shivering because he knew if we are to be found, and he saw their legs standing right at, basically right at just, if they were to just duck down, that's it. That's going to be the end of them. But the Prophet ﷺ was telling him, إِذْ يَقُولُ لِصَاحِبِهِ لَا تَحْزَنْ إِنَّ اللَّهَ مَعَنَا. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would tell us the story of what happened in that cave, when he was telling لِصَاحِبِهِ, his companion, who's that? That was Abu Bakr as-Siddiq. لَا تَحْزَنْ. Don't be in any sorrow. Allah is with us. What was he living in? He was recognizing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that is basically ruling and controlling, that this message will be in victory. Inna Allah ma'ana. Our Lord is with us. The Prophet ﷺ knew that this message is going to be victorious to the point that he himself will not live long enough to see it. How is it? Well, the Prophet ﷺ himself was telling them, الآن فتحت كنوز كسرى. Now, كنوز كسرى, the whole treasures of Kisra, Caesar, it's going to be right now, under Muslim rule. And then tells them, they would question, well, which one is going to be conquered first? Al-Qustantiniya, Constantinople, that great city, the capital of the Roman Empire? Or is it going to be Bayt al-Maqdis? The Prophet ﷺ says, Bayt al-Maqdis. When was Constantinople conquered? 700 years after the death of the Prophet ﷺ. When was Kisra? 5 years after the death of the Prophet ﷺ. When was Bayt al-Maqdis? 5 years after the Prophet ﷺ's death. But it goes farther, where the Prophet ﷺ said that you only saw one area. But the Prophet ﷺ actually said that the message, لا يبلغن أمر هذا الدين, the matter of this deen, it's going to reach far and far. ما بلغ الليل والنهار, to as far as what the sun, what it brings in daylight and night, would reach. Everywhere Islam will come, where not a house built of bricks and another built of tent and another built of whatever it is built of, the matter of this deen will go inside each and every single home. Is this during our time? It's going to happen. Just like it happened that Kunuz Kisra had fell, that the Persian Empire was defeated by the Muslims, and the Roman Empire defeated by the Muslims. It's going to happen when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decrees a matter. It's kun fayakun. That's it. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was telling the Prophet ﷺ, Wallahu ya'simuka minan nas. The Prophet ﷺ knew that nothing to worry about. But he still, as a prophet, even though he knew that he was protected, but he knew that he need to display a lesson to all the masses that were coming after him on how to take in consideration the different precautions that are necessary in order to make the right and wise decisions. Even though the Prophet ﷺ knew that was the case. Let's look at this story. An Arabi, what's an Arabi? An Arabi is basically a man that is a Bedouin. But here's one thing. Of course, Bedouins, they don't necessarily have the social skills. That's a different story. What happened? It was mentioned that the reason for the revelation of Wallahu ya'simuka minan nas was this story. This man comes in when the Muslims were resting. So what happened? He basically, the Prophet ﷺ is right there resting under a tree. And what happened? This man comes forward, which is this Arabi guy, comes forward and then stands right on top of the Prophet ﷺ, holding his sword, and he said, who's going to protect you from me now? So the Prophet ﷺ says, Allah. Allah. What happened? Al-Arabi, his hand right away shook from that word, and the sword basically fell out of his hand. And the story basically has different narrations. Is it that the man hit his head against the tree and what really happened? So you had different stories, what really happened during that time. Let's look at some of these stories. Number one, Al-Qadi Iyad. Who's Al-Qadi Iyad? We talked about Al-Qadi Iyad, and we said that there is this book, Ash-Shifa. This book is actually considered perhaps one of the best books in talking about the story of the Prophet ﷺ. It is translated into English, and he goes into speaking about Sirah. You could see it's in 2 volumes, and I don't know if both 2 volumes were translated. I just know that a summary of it was translated, and there were a number of different lectures from A to Z, really going into explaining this book. So Al-Qadi Iyad basically wrote this book, and in that book he said that this story was mentioned in a Sahih. In a Sahih, meaning it's an authentic story, that this man, Ghawrath ibn al-Harith, who was basically this Arabi, that the Prophet ﷺ had basically forgiven him, and he goes back to his people and he said, I had come from the best people, the best of the people. And of course, the ayah, إِذْ هَمَّ قَوْمٌ أَن يَبْسُطُوا إِلَيْكُمْ أَيْدِيَهُم. We mentioned the story when we talked about Surah al-Maida in ayah 11, so we mentioned it before. And certainly the story goes as follows. Let's see, in Sahih Muslim. Sahih Muslim basically tells us that the story is authentic. That Jabir ibn Abdullah narrated that he had said, we were with the Prophet ﷺ in a battle near Najd. And then the Prophet ﷺ, well, basically, they come across an area. It seemed like it was, let's see, right there. Maybe this is going to be easier for most of you to understand right there. Okay. And they come across an area, I guess, that had a lot of thorny trees. So the Prophet ﷺ basically rests under one of those trees and hangs his own sword in one of the branches on the tree. And everyone else basically finds a different place to, I guess, rest under another shade. And the Prophet ﷺ basically comes forward and he says, a man came to me while I was sleeping. He took the sword and I woke up and he was standing right above me. And I did not see but his sword in his hand, basically up above me. And he says, who's going to prevent you from me now? And he said, Allah. And he said, who's going to prevent you from me now? And I said, Allah. And he then, of course, the sword falls from his hand. And then the Prophet ﷺ puts it on, basically, tells him, basically holds the sword. And so the Prophet ﷺ now holds the sword and he says, well, who prevents you from me now? Of course, the story has a number of different narrations. So let's go for the other narration, which is why I took you to this page. All right. Let's see. So the man in the other narration, that the Arabi, this man, when basically, um, basically, the Prophet ﷺ holds the sword. And now, of course, when the sword fell off the man's hand, the Prophet ﷺ then holds the sword. And then he says, be amongst the best of the people. Now, Al-Arabi, of course, al, al, Al-Hajjaj, he said, Al-Awaqib tusayyiru al-ayiyya khatiba. Whenever someone is in trauma or in fear, that basically makes them become very eloquent. Why? Because they know there's a consequence. So now this Arabi is basically all of a sudden, even though he was coming to kill and assassinate the Prophet ﷺ, but all of a sudden he basically came, and once he felt that his life was in danger, he basically said, "Be one of the best people," because he knew that the Prophet ﷺ was right there, coming with a mission to be the best person, and then the Prophet ﷺ says, do you bear witness that there is no God worthy of worship but Allah? He said, no. He said, no. But did he accept Islam? No. Did the Prophet ﷺ kill him because he said no? No. What did he do? He said, but I'll promise you that I would never support and never come forward to kill you or be with anyone that would basically fight you. So the Prophet ﷺ let him go. He went to his people and he said, I had come with the best of the people. Now, in Waqidi, we wouldn't necessarily take stories coming from Al-Waqidi because the stories in Maghazi al-Waqidi were really not authentic, but some narrations at least had mentioned that this man that was coming to kill the Prophet ﷺ, had become Muslim. Regardless, we just know, of course, the Sahaba mentioned the story and basically tell us what happened and how this man basically thought that he was going to be capable of assassinating the Prophet ﷺ. Right? So the Prophet ﷺ also mentions that there was a time, he said, Ibn Abbas had mentioned the story, that the Prophet ﷺ had said, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had sent me with the revelation, I was ضِقْتُ بِهَا ذَرْعًا. What does that mean? He was feeling a huge amount of stress. This stress because عرفت أن من الناس من يكذبني. He knew that there were some people that were going to be in denial and denying, and certainly to be denying what he had said basically means that they were seeing him as a threat. So he was recognizing that, and this ayah was basically revealed to tell him not to be in fear, because when you're living, of course, in distress, you're going to also feel insecure. You're also going to feel some form of anxiety. Let's continue right there. Abu Talib, who is basically his uncle, would always send with the Prophet ﷺ some men from Bani Hashim to guard the Prophet ﷺ until this ayah was revealed. Wallahu ya'asumukum minan nas. So then the Prophet ﷺ tells his uncle, "O uncle, the Lord Almighty had protected me from the harm of jinn and ins or human, and I don't need anyone to guard me." Here's one thing. I want to look at this. You could see in number 4 that the Prophet ﷺ was living in distress because he was in fear. You could see, let's see, in the takhrij right there, he said, لم نقف عليه من قول ابن عباس. And I want you to look at this. This is really important. Okay, this is a little, a little off topic, but it's important to understand how we would understand Islamic resources. So, yes, certainly we do see that this was mentioned in al-Qurtubi, but then after revision, you could see um, that Ibn Abbas, even though Ibn Abbas had said that the Prophet ﷺ said that he was living in distress and so forth, al-Qurtubi had mentioned the quote, but here, after revision, he said we couldn't find. He didn't say that it was necessarily weak, but he said we couldn't find the resources. It could be there in some resources that we don't have published today, or perhaps at least the manuscripts that we know of today. But to be fair, the scholar that went over these resources and basically wanted to make sure that we're getting at least different resources and where these quotations are coming from, which is basically called التحقيق. He said, well, it was mentioned by al-Wahidi, and this is the reference. It was mentioned in basically al-Wasit. It was mentioned by al-Baghawi. It was mentioned by Ibn al-Jawzi, but and certainly Abu Nu'aym, and these are the resources that they were mentioned in. He said, but we couldn't really find a chain of narration to really scrutinize whether this is authentic or not, even though it was mentioned in these resources. So just to keep in mind, just because you find something in a book of tafsir, it doesn't necessarily mean that, yes, I found a text for it and therefore I'm going to take it and I've got an evidence to prove something. And that's why studying ulum al-sharia and in particular hadith is extremely important to make sure that when you're studying Islam, you're studying it and making sure that the resources you're going to, not necessarily just books, but you're going back to authentic resources and basically making sure that you know where you're going. Let's see. What about the story of Abu Talib basically sending some men to guard the Prophet ﷺ, and then the Prophet ﷺ said, well, I don't want you to send anybody with me. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protected me from all of this. Well, it sounds very inspirational, doesn't it? Well, let's see. Same thing with number 5. You could see al-Tabarani basically mentioned it. You could see some of these resources, but not because it sounds inspirational. We're not going to change the truth of the matter of what the level of authenticity that is. So al-Haythami, well, basically, in his book, Majma' al-Zawaid wa Manba' al-Fawaid, he basically goes over specifically Tabarani, Abu Ya'la, al-Bazzar, al-Ahmad ibn Hanbal, those books. And then he would basically scrutinize those resources, or at least the chain of narration. And he said, well, in that chain of narration, then there is this person, Nadr ibn Abdul Rahman. He said, and this person is basically not a person of authenticity, at least. And let's see, Al-Hafiz ibn Kathir, he basically said this is a strange hadith. What does it mean to say strange? Strange doesn't mean it's like, oh, that's weird. No, what they really wanted to say is that we don't really have any known collection to mentioning that story, or at least a chain of narration that is supporting such a story or such a claim. And that's why, of course, let's say the scholars that were reviewing تفسير القرطبي says والصحيح أن هذه الآية مدنية. And what is, of course, what we know of is that the chronology of this ayah, of this surah, is that it was revealed after the migration to Medina. And therefore, to say that this story and the reason for the revelation of this ayah happened in Mecca is basically not supported according to what they had basically mentioned through their study and even study in those resources. And that's why even al-Qurtubi said, well, this would mean that if these reports of the Prophet ﷺ basically saying, when I was in Mecca, I was feeling distressed because people were basically denying me, and Abu Talib was sending these people to protect me, all of that. He said, well, this is al-Qurtubi. He said, قلت وهذا يقتضي أن ذلك كانت بمكة. What that would mean, if we were to take these reports as authentic, that would mean the revelation of that particular ayah was in Mecca, and this is not accurate. And we know that this surah is basically Madaniya, meaning that it was revealed during the Prophet ﷺ was basically after the migration, and certainly not before. And of course, we could see another more authentic narration. Well, not more, but it's an authentic narration. It was narrated by Muslim that, let's see, the story goes as follows. Sayyidah Aisha said, the Prophet ﷺ stayed up until basically at night, مقدمة المدينة. So basically near Medina one time at night. And then he was basically saying, either telling Sayyidah Aisha or telling himself, basically speaking out loud. And he said, ليت رجلا صالحا من أصحابي يحرسني الليلة. I wish that a man, one of the men, of the pious men from my companions, would guard me tonight. And then Sayyidah Aisha said, as while we were basically, just in this place near Medina, then they heard some khashkhashata silah. What is al-khashkhasha? It's basically, what is that called in English when, I keep forgetting the word. Onomatopoeia. I said it finally. What does that mean? So it's basically that sound. Khashkhasha, it's like you're making the sound, and the actual sound is what the word is trying to mimic. Okay, so here, khashkhasha silah is basically the sound of somehow somebody coming in carrying some arms, and they were coming in, I guess, near the tent. So the Prophet ﷺ said, who is that? So he said, Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas. And the Prophet ﷺ said, what brings you here? And he said, I basically felt that some fear over the Prophet, peace be upon him. So I had come to guard you. So the Prophet ﷺ basically made the dua for him, and he went to sleep. Okay. And in another narration, that's not necessarily, when we say fi ghayr sahih, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's not an authentic narration, but that it's not in either in the Sahih Muslim or Sahih al-Bukhari. And he said that Sayyidah Aisha had said, while we were with, well, basically after the Prophet ﷺ had basically said what he had said, wanting someone and wishing that someone would come over to protect him or at least guard him. And he said, who's that? And they said, Sa'd and Hudhayfa. They responded, it's Sa'd and Hudhayfa. We had come to guard you. So the Prophet ﷺ went, of course, they came in, Sa'd and Hudhayfa ibn al-Yaman, that's Sa'd ibn Abu Waqqas right there, and Hudhayfa ibn al-Yaman coming to basically guard the Prophet ﷺ. So then he went to sleep, and they basically said, حَتَّى سَمِعْتُ غَطِيتَهُ, until we had heard the sound of his sleep. So it was, in other words, fully asleep. And this ayah was revealed, and the Prophet ﷺ basically, of course, was sleeping on قبة Adam. قبة Adam is it's like it's like a leather thing that is stuffed with uh, leaves and twigs from palm trees. And then the Prophet ﷺ said, انصرفوا أيها الناس فقد عصمني الله. And then he said, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protected me. That's it. You can go now. You could, all right, let's see. And this was narrated by Tirmidhi. إسناده وحسن إسناده الحافظ. So الحافظ في الفتح, that's فتح الباري. الحافظ here is الحافظ ibn Hajar al-Asqalani. And that he regarded it as the chain of narration was actually Hasan. Hasan is a form of an authentic hadith, which basically means اتصل إسناده بنقل العدل الذي خف ضبطه. So what is the difference between a Hasan chain of narration and a Sahih chain of narration? A Sahih chain of narration ما اتصل إسناده بنقل العدل الضابط عن العدل الضابط إلى متابع غير شذوذ ولا علة قادحة. You would have a chain of narration where each and every single person in the chain of narration are competent in their religiosity, competent in their ability to basically transmit the hadith itself. In other words, pass it on. They're competent in their memory, competent in their religion and piety. And each and every single one within that chain of narration is basically competent in their religiosity, competent in their memory, met the other person, and basically that. But a chain of narration that is Hasan is basically having one of the figures within the chain of narration is not completely, or let's say not fully competent in their memory in transmitting the hadith. So this is it. I know we really passed our time, but I was really enjoying living with the Sahaba in the Prophet ﷺ in this hadith and in this part, in this portion of Tafseer. What I'll do, inshallah, we'll continue tomorrow. Inshallah, continue with the same ayah. There's really a lot to say. But subhanakallah wa bihamdik nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk nashhadu an la ilaha illa ant. I would be happy.
I have a question, or actually,
Go ahead, dear.
Okay, sorry. So, you said the Bedouins, they lacked manners, right?
I don't want to say it that way, and that
Well, yeah, I mean the common sense.
well, I mean, no,
because
no,
I
no.
mean you kind of learn that, when you're
Let's say
in the
social
environment.
skills.
Yeah. So, but they were also the best in Arabic.
So, okay, so let's say they lack social skills, and so there are some certain things that actually come at a price. Okay,
Mhm.
so the more you deal with people, and of course the more you would come in with different cultures, etc. Of course, there's going to be at a price. The influences are definitely going to be, whether it's your culture, whether it's your vision, whether it's good or bad. I mean, it comes at a number of different things. So we're not necessarily saying don't deal with people, but at the time you, I guess, need to understand the context within the Arabian Peninsula. Those that were, let's say, Arab, those that were outside of the city, they definitely had a better, let's say, preservation and more classical in their Arabi than the ones that were living in the city, whether due to, of course, the different influences that were coming inside the city, or, of course, the different, let's call it different, the different influences that were coming from different people. So let's just say the Bedouins were too organic. Let's say it that way, too organic in everything. Maybe we could use that better term.
But I was just curious, like, because the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he understood the situation because I mean, obviously in Mecca, it's a place of trade and people come. I mean, I'm assuming did they go for tawaf and Hajj and like the Arab, the Bedouins?
Arab, you mean?
Yeah.
Well, certainly, but you want to remember that the Arab, their population was way less anyways. Because
Right.
you're speaking about well, who are al-Arab? Let me explain one thing. So al-Arab are very primitive in their understanding of life and understanding resources. So they don't have the education to, I guess, extract water from the earth to build. So they'll use the simplest means possible. Even when it comes to searching for water, they don't know how to dig in the ground to get water. No, they would use the resources in one area, whether it's the vegetation, whether it's the water. Then once that becomes basically the end of it, that's when they would carry their belongings and simply what would they do with it? They would just go and find somewhere else. In other words, they don't use any form of technology to figure out, well, okay, I'm here. What are the different ways that I can make this stay a place that I can stay in my place and I guess find different ways to make this livable? No, they don't find different ways. They'll find different places. So that's why they'll migrate to different places. They'll move from one area to, and they're living nomadic life. So, and of course, these people, they can't live in large groups because if you're living in large groups, then you're basically going to abuse the resources and they're going to run out easily. So they would live in smaller groups because the resources that they're trying to find are usually limited anyways.
Okay.
Okay? They're
Yeah,
until the time of today,
I
you would
was
have
just
the ones living like that.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that hadith about when the man, the Bedouin, he came in the masjid and urinated. How the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he knew how to deal with him. You know what I mean? But
Right.
the Sahaba, were they not exposed to these kind of people, or did they just not have the hikmah of, you know what I mean? Sorry.
So fair enough. You want to keep in mind that no matter who you are, you're not a prophet. And of course, no matter how educated, no matter, what type of intelligence you had, at the end, there are certain things that would come in as influences. You're living in, let's say, a society, hey, you're speaking an American accent and you grew up in a certain society, and the way that you're going to judge probably another culture or probably someone's behavior, you cannot whatsoever separate it from the culture, the influences that you grew up in. And it's going to be extremely hard, if not even impossible, for you to separate yourself from what influenced your, let's say, your reaction. That's a thing. Our reactions, they are a product of the culture and the life that we grew up in.
Oh yeah, that's
Your
true.
it's you can't separate yourself. Your reaction, the emotions, all of those, they're a product of where you come from. Yesterday, or the day before it, I went into this restaurant. So they had a croissant, and then we asked that we would heat the croissant. Now, the people that were running this coffee place were French. So she said, you're asking me to heat the croissant? I said, yes, please. And she said, here's what I want you to do. I've got my French friends sitting at that table. I'm going to insert the croissant inside this microwave, but I want you not show them that we just heated the croissant. And I started laughing. I was like, why? And she said, because what you did was completely unacceptable in our French culture. All right. I know it was rather a funny thing. She was trying to be, I guess, sarcastic because they don't do that. But this is, maybe that's a little off example right there. But I just want to mention that the reaction that we might react in is a product of what society we grew up in. And the Arab, of course, the Arab, they grew up in a society where they don't recognize spaces and places. All right.
Okay, so did other people used to go and learn the Arabic, like the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam? I was just curious, sorry.
You mean from the Arab?
Yes.
From the Arab, did anybody actually come and learn? So we do have,
No, I mean,
let's
was it, so it was common for all the children to go and learn Arabic?
No, it wasn't common.
Okay.
It wasn't common. It was only it was only for those that could afford it.
Oh, okay. Jazakallah khair. That makes sense. Jazakallah.
Right. So it was think of it as, special tutoring. Not everybody can afford to have special tutors. Only the elite. So why did the Prophet ﷺ get to go to Halima Sa'diyah? Well, he went to Halima Sa'diyah. It wasn't just special tutoring, but it was also special kind of, let's call it nutritional care. All right. Only the ones that were considered the elite. And so why did the Prophet ﷺ thought he was poor? Well, that's why Halima Sa'diyah hesitated to take the Prophet ﷺ, because he was basically an orphan, poor, and she was worried that no one would be capable of paying for basically his stay. So those Bedouins, Halima Sa'diyah and the others, they were making a fortune out of taking the elite children. It was only the elite children. So it's not every child, but basically was going there. No, it was only for the elite. They were capable of affording, let's call it nutritional care, linguistic care, and all of that. That was only for the elite. But the Prophet ﷺ basically got, I guess, the opportunity from Halima Sa'diyah that, hey, he was the only kid left. So it's either that I take him, even if it's at scraps of pay or who knows what it is, but hey, that was the only kid that was left. So she accepted to take him. But when she took him the first time, she noticed the barakah, the blessings that were coming with him. So then when the following year she brought him back, she didn't want to trade him for another elite child because she had seen that this child was coming at a value and bringing in a lot more value than the value of any other child she had ever taken care of. It was a barakah that she had never seen in. So why did she return him later on? Well, she was the one that mentions the story. And she said that the reason, and she had become Muslim later on, by the way, she was the one that mentioned the story that the reason why she had needed to return him was the story of Hadith al-Shaqqa Sadr, because the Prophet ﷺ basically had come, or these two men basically come to the Prophet ﷺ and would open up his chest. The children would run and scurry to Halima Sa'diyah when the Prophet ﷺ was wrestling these two men. Why was he wrestling them? He's a child. Why would you wrestle them? Well, because he didn't know what they were up to. but he was a child of courage still. Even if they're men, I'm going to do whatever it takes to protect myself. Even though he's a young child, but no, I'm going to do whatever it takes. He was wrestling them, but then they basically told him that no, this is what Shaitan was using in order to control you. They took it out, basically washed his heart, and they were watching this. Now, the aftermath, Halima Sa'diya saw that his face was looking rather different color and saw that there was a scar on his chest. She didn't know what that was, so she related it. It was some kind of a demon. That's what she couldn't understand anything else. She basically thought, well, I could see that there was a change in his face, a change in his chest. There's a scar that the children, they all saw these two men coming out of nowhere, and they took him, and that's all she said. She said, I thought it was a demon coming to him, and that's why I returned him to his mother. I didn't know what that was. She didn't think that they were angels whatsoever, because to their understanding that, hey, there's only one thing that could make a change. It was going to be a demon. So that's what she thought. She thought it was a demon. It was probably jinn, something, but she knew something had happened. She knew that there was something rather supernatural that happened, but she didn't know what to associate it with. So she returned him later to Amina, his mother, because she didn't want to be liable for anything. She didn't want to be liable if anything were to go wrong once again and get some other scar and then be held responsible for it. What did you do? So she said, I told his mother what had happened, and his mother, so this is who's narrating the story? This is Halima Sa'diya. So Halima Sa'diya was telling us, because his mother died a long time ago, but Halima Sa'diya was saying the story that his mother told her that she was very confident that he was going to be protected, and that he basically was going to be of something magnificent, because she was getting these dreams. So now, who's narrating the story of Amina and what was happening between these two women? Now it was Halima Sa'diya. After she had become Muslim, she said, hey, I met his mother. This is what his mother was telling me. This is what his mother had basically experienced. This is basically her take on this. She was not worried. She was confident that there was something behind this. And she was telling her of some of the dreams that she was getting, some of the things that she was realizing about this extraordinary child.
SubhanAllah. So that's how we got the information from the
That's how we
hadith.
got the information.
SubhanAllah.
Yeah.
And it's I basically, I was really keen to know, well, who's the one that narrated the stories about Amina and who was really that. And it's another woman. It's that woman, Halima Sa'diya. It was, whenever you would have a child, I ran a daycare before, Noura, you know that. The stories about I guess the behavior, the child, what he ate last and what he was doing and how he was reacting in your daycare were basically going to be the stories that you would exchange with the mother and the parent. And certainly, because you as a daycare provider, that's basically what you're doing the whole day. You're with this child, you're watching their behavior, you're doing all of that. That's all you're caring about. And the mother, of course, while she was away, the most important information to her that she would care about as a mother was really, how was my child behaving while I was absent? Because to her, every single movement matters to her. Every single Every single movement, every single story, every single laughter, every single food that he ate, what he ate, and what kind, how many diapers did he do, and all of that to you, that's important information. That's to you important information. It's dear to you. So here are these two women exchanging this information, and we get this information coming from Halima Sadiya, a direct resource to tell us what the mom was saying. أشهد بأن محمد النبي. That's what we could say. And سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نستغفرك ونتوب إليك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت. And inshallah, go ahead, my dear.
Is it too late to ask you because
Go ahead.
2 hours too time for you? Okay, when you mention about this eye on 67 بلغ وإن لم تبلغ نعم. Yeah, you that Qurtubi explained it that تأديب للنبي صلى الله عليه وسلم. The first time I hear it, I said, "Oh, Nabi صلى الله عليه وسلم to say this word." We know its meaning, but you explain it great. تعليم النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم.
Exactly.
Can I match it with this? I explain or understand the meaning of أدبني ربي فأحسن تأديبي أي علمني ربي فأحسن تعليمي.
أحسنت. There you go. So let me say, in our modern Arabic, التأديب is seen as to scold, to somehow speak and somehow, correct. Somehow it's a derogatory term. Okay. But that's not the classical Arabic. The classical Arabic, تأديب is not to scold, and is not whatsoever a form of somehow a derogatory thing. No, التأديب للنبي صلى الله عليه وسلم, it's a form of enriching his akhlaq, enriching his mannerisms. In other words, mentoring him. So when you look at تأديب in لغة عربية, the modern لغة عربية, it sounds like, it's form of a scolding, but no. In classical Arabiya, تأديب actually means mentoring. Mentoring, where it's guiding, where it's training, where it's directing. That's what التأديب is. Let's see, Noura, what are you saying? See, sometimes people who learn Fusha first have advantage. Noura feels that she's basically
No, I'm just kidding.
the privilege. No, Noura, alhamdulillah, I'm very proud of all of you. Even though, yes, certainly it's a privilege to know Lugha Arabiya. There's definitely no doubt about that. But alhamdulillah, even if you may not necessarily get to the level of, let's say, mastering Lugha Arabiya like a person that is considered a mother tongue, but ما لا يدرك جله لا يترك كله. If you don't necessarily get to at least the complete stage, it doesn't mean that we would leave everything. I'm very proud of all of you for putting the effort, and I want you to keep in mind that mastering, or at least, let's say, excelling in a certain knowledge is one thing, but getting to Jannah is not going to be dependent or determined on how far you would excel in that knowledge. But it is determined based on how much you excel in your sincerity and what you would apply and how far it penetrated in your heart. Just keep that in mind. Keep that in mind. Where did we get that from? You can have an A++ and a PhD and all of that in ilm, but you could see that ilm didn't penetrate their heart. And you can have somebody that knew a couple words in Arabic, maybe mashallah, alhamdulillah, that was it. But iman and ilm penetrated their heart deeper than a person with a PhD in ilm. Therefore, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to put that person that Iman penetrated their heart. That's what matters. In that highest rank of ilm, put them in the in the highest rank of Iman, put them in the highest rank of Jannah. That's why we would know that the Prophet ﷺ had said that أول من تسعر بهم النار, that there are 4 people, the first ones that would be basically exposed to hellfire. He mentioned a person that's a scholar, a person that is a hafiz, a person that is basically a person that is known to giving donations, and another person that is a mujahid. You would not whatsoever doubt that these people, hey, they really invested a lot. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the Prophet were telling us that it's not only about what you invest in effort, but it's what you invest on the inside in sincerity. That's what matters. So put in the sincerity, put in the effort. That's the scale. Remember when we talked about yesterday, we're talking about that scale. We're talking about وَأَقِيمُوا الْوَزْنَ, one thing at the expense of the other. No, we need to basically أَقِيمُوا الْوَزْنَ. Make sure you put in the effort, the sincerity. Let that be your major focus, and then you're going to see that other things are going to be reduced. There's no way. أَقِيمُوا الْوَزْنَ وَلَا تُخْسِرُوا الْمِيزَانَ. So put in the effort and don't feel that, well, I'm never going to get there. Your Jannah level is not determined by how much you mastered in knowing Lugha Arabiya, but that's a key to helping you probably growing in your deen. That's one way. How can I become a better person in my deen? Yeah, it's really important. Get to ilm. Put in more dhikr. Put in more, I guess, energy and effort in applying your deen. But I'm struggling. Yes, ilm will help you get there. Keep going. Don't stop. Keep going. Come on, you can do it. And those keys are important. I hope I answered that one. I'm proud of all of you. I know it's a lot to work on, and I understand. I mean, I studied French, but I could never probably make I guess a whole sentence that is a complete sentence. Even though I studied for 6 years, I can't imagine myself actually speaking French fluently, even though I tried to continue studying French. But I know it's still, I guess, hey, I studied Hebrew, and I can't necessarily make a complete sentence. And I had my grandmother who spoke Spanish around me. I guess Spanish was probably going to be the easiest thing because I studied it, or at least I was familiar with it during my early childhood. But I can relate that when you're studying a language, that it's not easy if you didn't study it from your early childhood. I can really relate. I can't imagine myself speaking fluent Hebrew, nor imagine myself speaking fluent French. And I can relate. I can imagine myself speaking Spanish, but well, that's because, I was hearing it from my early childhood, but I can definitely relate with how hard it is to speak classical Arabic or understand classical Arabic if you didn't master it or speak it or at least get acquainted with it in early childhood.
So whatever language we explain or make tafsir, يعني not enough، يعني لا يشبع منه التفسير، لا يشبع منه بأي لغة.
Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely,
روعة.
absolutely. And subhanallah, I mean, exactly. I mean, well, I basically learned English in my early childhood and learned Arabic in my early childhood. But to be honest, even when I would give the tafsir, I try as much as I can. I try as much as I can to get, I guess, the inspiration I would get from Arabic language to try to demonstrate it in English as much as I can. But I do recognize that there are certain times that it becomes rather challenging to bring about the accurate and intricate meaning that you would find in Arabic and give it into English. So that's why you could see that I'm, sometimes I would say going left and right, and sometimes going around in all these circles in trying to, I guess, demonstrate and trying to give that inspiration, that meaning. And I would use all these different methods to, I guess, helping you see in the other language what this word really contains. It's kind of like describing an elephant. You can describe the ears, you can describe the tail, you can describe, each one's describing it from a different area. So I try to go all around the picture and the image in order to help you get the best picture possible. Because I know how it feels to recognize that there is some supernatural magnificent feelings, magnificent messages, magnificent inspirations within the Quran, within Tafseer. And at one point in my life, I didn't speak fluent Arabic. And I do recognize how lame, and sometimes it was feeling like I want to get to that level of certainty, and I want to feel what other people are feeling. I know it's there. I know it's there. And I didn't speak fluent Arabic at the time, but I knew it was there to give me that inspiration, to give me that certainty, to give me that, I guess, that the sense of sweetness. I knew it was there. But I couldn't get to it because I was tongue-tied. I didn't understand fluent Arabic. So it was needing more Arabic to learn. So I knew that those that don't speak Arabic, that's the most thing that they would want to see. They want to taste the sweetness, see the magnificence, and they want to sense the supernatural thing, of course, within these ayat. So all I could do is use my English language. That's why I would, I guess, find myself going into tafsir and taking you guys into beyond the hours that we were supposed to be, I guess, doing, because I just can't get myself out of it. I can't get myself out of it because I do recognize that at one point that was my dream. It was my dream to let others see I guess that area that without knowing Lugha Arabiya, they would not be capable of seeing. But I still want to use the English language to at least deliver that piece of it, even without their Lugha Arabiya. I do recognize that it's going to be, I don't want to say impossible, but I would say it was going to be very and extremely challenging for many to reach a certain level of fluency in learning Lugha Arabiya. So I'll do my
If
best.
Salman al-Farsi did it, radiallahu
Well, you
then
want to remember
no.
Salman al-Farisi, yes, he was Farisi, but he still lived around Arab even when he was younger.
Oh, okay, sorry. Okay, I will be quiet now.
The one Suhaib al-Rumi
Yeah.
was probably Suhaib al-Rumi, even though he was originally Arab, he was from Iraq.
Yeah.
But he was kidnapped as a child, and Umar ibn al-Khattab would often say, this is the Arabi that can't speak Arabic. He would often say that this is the Arabi that can't speak Arabic. So he's originally Arabic, but then he was kidnapped by, of course, Rum, and then he was taken as a slave by Rum, so he grew up amongst the Rum, and then he was bought by Abdullah ibn Jad'an. Abdullah ibn Jad'an was a chieftain in Mecca, but Abdullah ibn Jad'an had, I guess, this good character for children that were taken as slaves. He would just free them. So he happened to come across Suhaib al-Rumi. He freed him. And Suhaib al-Rumi, of course, later, I guess, used his potentials, used his skills. The challenges basically got him stronger. He became Muslim. And before he had even become Muslim, he was already, even though, hey, here's the thing. Whenever you don't have the resources to get you stronger, you would have to depend on yourself. So he started depending on himself, and he became basically a rich person because that was the only thing that he would depend on. He had to depend on himself, and he had to learn how to make those resources and learn how to do business because he didn't have a family to support him. He had to do it on his own after being freed. So certainly he did it on his own, and he became one of the richest men in Mecca. And that's why when he wanted to migrate to Medina, he basically was, I guess, followed by the people of Mecca because they considered that, wait a minute, you going away with your money is going to bring about, of course, economical instability within Mecca. So what did they do? Well, they basically followed him. They were like, no, you're not going to go with your money. So he said, no, you want the money? The money is right there in Mecca, in such and such place. Go get it. The Prophet ﷺ said, رَبِحَ الْبَيْعَ أَبَا يَحْيَى. He let go. What did he do? He wanted to win his deen and compromise his money. Let go. You want the money? You're gonna let me go? Yeah, sure. You know what? The money is in such and such jug, and it's right there, and go get it. If you just care, they just left him because to them, they don't really care about him. To them, they just cared about the money because he was considered of a place of prosperity for, I guess, the Meccan economy. And just look at that. But this is something that we also learn. Don't give all the privileges to your children. Sometimes to let them search for such privileges and work towards it, that's what's going to make them successful.
So don't worry or don't be surprised if you see me one time in Malaysia.
Yeah, it's a beautiful place. You're gonna love it.
All of the knowledge.
It's a beautiful place. You're really gonna love it. You're really gonna love it.
I'm not looking for the place or the nature. I have it in Lebanon, but I'm looking for seeking the knowledge from you.
Allah يحفظك يا ربي. Allah Kareem. Allah Kareem. Subhanallah. Subhanallah, Allah Kareem. You never know how this world just turns and subhanallah, it's ya Allah, that's it. My own marriage was basically a story of that, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala just guiding me into one area and telling me, no, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will do the tadbir. He will do that direction and guidance to get you to what is best for you.
Right.
This is it.
This dunya.
So, subhanallah. Allah yahfadhku ya Rabbi.
Looking for the knowledge in dunya. If you want to stay with you on Zoom or face to face, and inshallah al-akhirah.
I hope you don't say تسمع بالمعيدية خيرا من أن تراه. Right?
بالأنسي inshallah.
Inshallah. This is it. And inshallah, سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نستغفرك ونتوب إليك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت. We'll see you all tomorrow. Stay tuned.
جزاك الله خير. بارك الله.
جزاك الله خير. السلام عليكم.
وعليكم.